Jae Edmonds is one of them. There are not many people with whom I have actually shared a bedroom in my life. Not many. Even fewer, a very small percentage of those are men. But Jae and I were in Moscow in, I don't know, late 1980s, I guess, as part of a US-Soviet exchange where we went over and over again to try to introduce energy efficiency into the Russian understanding of the energy problem, which were more or less absent. And Jae is I like the phrase nodal point when it describes certain communities. The person who everybody knows and who knows everyone, who's taking everything going on into account. And each field has a few. And Jae is one of the nodal points of the community which is trying to develop credible alternative futures with a consistent methodology, going out 50 to 100 years for the country, for the world. He's been doing it from the base at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Now is on the campus of the University of Maryland in Chevy Chase. Not Chevy Chase, College Park. I know it's on the College Park, Maryland. He lives in Chevy Chase. And Jae has been a real, Jae runs one of the most important of a half dozen modeling groups which do what's called integrated assessment. They try to project the future in a self-consistent way and show you the significance of this or that assumption. Jae is also, as he's going to show you in an early slide, been integral to the IPCC process through Working Group 3. And if you've heard my earlier introductions and the earlier talks, you can have a map of Working Group 1 is science, Working Group 2 is impacts, Working Group 3 is mitigation. And mitigation is largely a project driven by the modelers. So we are now heading for the 5th assessment report, and Jae is not resting on his laurels. He's right in the middle of things as the 5th assessment report, Working Group 3 program is established. Let me remind you that this is the next to last of what will be a total of 6 talks in this series, put together magnificently with the help of students at NOAA and at GFDL and on campus. It's co-sponsored, as you see, by the Princeton Environmental Institute, by STEP in this building, Science, Technology, Environmental Program, a policy program, and by NOAA, which is the sponsor of GFDL. So is the next talk here. What is the day of the final talk? May 7th, Gary Yo, professor at Wesleyan, also in the mitigation and Working Group 3 world, will be talking in this room at 12:30, in Geotan at 4:30. At Geotan at 4:30, that rounds out the series, which has really been done wonderfully in a very short period of time. So, Jae's talk is emissions mitigation and climate stabilization.
Let me just start off by thanking Rob for a really marvelous introduction. I'm glad this is the next to last talk. I think you're the one that ended this series. I want to begin by thanking you guys for inviting me here. I'm going to get up here regularly, and it's a particular honor to be here and give a talk on climate change on Earth Day. I'm indebted to Elena, who for her persistence. I was a very tough person to talk into. She's very persuasive. So just give in at the beginning, and you just save yourself a lot of time. I will also thank the sponsors of the research that I've done. Some of whom are on the bottom. Some of those are affiliations. I sometimes feel like the transparencies that I use are kind of like a NASCAR with all these logos on it. We started off with the IPCC. The title of this series, if you go back, is Inside the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Science, Policy, and politics. And just last year, the fourth assessment report was released. There were three, the three working group reports: the physical science, which is the top little logo up here. That's the cover, and then the impacts, and then working group 3, which is mitigation of climate change, and then the synthesis report. And it's a very impressive body of work, and I won't even attempt to summarize even group 3 because it actually is a great deal of work to do. And in fact, even though the title of this is Inside the IPCC, you're actually going to get very little of any inside information. I'm not going to be the one to tell you that BirdNet's and Oprah Winfrey are an item. If you want the slides, there's actually a very nice presentation on Working Group 3 report. You just go to the IPCC website, you can download it. But I'm not going to give that today. I'm going to give my own assessment. I will say that I have a long history with the IPCC. It actually goes back to the origins of the IPCC, trace back to the second meeting at VLOC. It actually wasn't the first meeting. It was organized by UNEP, WMO, and ICSU, which, when they organized it, was the International Council of Scientific Unions, and now it's the International Council for Science, which led to both the IPCC and the Toronto Climate Conference, and actually led to the politicization of climate change. Before that, it was a very small community meeting in very small groups to discuss basically before 1985. I worked on the first assessment in something called the Response Strategy Working Group, which was Working Group 3. It is notable for two things. One is that it never published a report, and two, it was the first meeting I ever chaired where I had an international incident where one of the delegations, the UK delegations, walked out in protest. So that was interesting for me. The second assessment report I worked on Working Groups 2 and 3, and I gave that up when I got to the third assessment and only worked on 3. And then the fourth assessment I worked on in Chapter 2 and on technology, which has sort of been the home of my research. So I'm one of 168 authors, and still haven't learned my lessons because I'm on the North Viker steering group to try to put together a plan for the fifth assessment report, which wasn't even held when the North Viker, which I hadn't even been charged with the North Viker meeting was held. So anyway, but there is now, as of April 10th, a fifth assessment report. We're Group 1. Ron will get that out in 2013. No problems. and Working Groups 2 and 3 will tag along and get it out in 2014. Now, sort of having to pay my dues to the IPCC, here's what I'm going to talk about. And I've got 10 points that, given that I have 90 minutes and I've never had 90 minutes to talk before, I sort of threw in everything I could think of. But actually not. I'm going to start off, and it's really going to be about stabilization. And so the first thing I'm going to argue is the stabilization of CO2 concentrations and the other greenhouse gases, which are much less challenging than CO2. Even below present levels is feasible. I think this issue of is it feasible or not feasible that got raised in the third assessment report due to a little argument that Morita-san and Kaya-san were having. He introduced that to argue with Kaya that you couldn't do this on the basis of fusion or space solar power. But this issue of feasibility really is I think, a red herring. It's perfectly possible. And I think that I'm going to talk a lot about technology. But technology is actually, its role isn't to make it possible. Its role is to control the cost and minimize the amount of resources that are diverted from other ends to the end of obtaining the environmental goal of stabilization. Second is that stabilizing the concentration of CO2 means absolutely fundamental change to the global energy system. It doesn't have to happen instantly, but ultimately the global energy system will be just absolutely radically altered. Stabilization means a value on carbon, and I'm going to come back to this at the end. But climate change is the ultimate public goods problem. And a public goods problem occurs when you have a good that is consumed by everyone. And this is a public good which has a particularly vexing character to it, in that it's not just that no individual nation or no individual person can capture all of the benefits from their mitigative action. Not even the entire world, a generation of people living at one time, can capture all the benefits from the emissions mitigations that they undertake. And so it is a global public goods problem that is unlike anything that humans have ever dealt with, and I think we are only beginning to discover how difficult that's going to be. But there's no way that I can capture all the benefits, even to my actions. There's no way that you can capture them. There's no way that your generation can capture them. And yet, if we don't actually take on this public responsibility and deal with this public good, then we're going to be end up as frogs in the pond as the heat gets turned up slowly. So I'm going to argue that to stabilize, you're going to have to require value for carbon, and not just a value for carbon. One of the most finely held beliefs on the Hill is bureaucratic staffers that they will start with the price of carbon, and then that'll be the highest price that we ever pay, and that the price will decline after that, and things will get cheaper because we'll learn how to do things better. In fact, it's a stock pollutant. It's not a flow pollutant. Its value rises over time, and ultimately because you're taking carbon that was removed over tens to hundreds of million years time scale and reintroducing it in the atmosphere over years, to decades, to even a century. The Earth has only one thing to do with it, and that's partition it between the atmosphere and the oceans. And some of it will be resident in the atmosphere 1,000 years from now. So ultimately, you're driving emissions to zero for stabilization, and that's a tall order, given how fossil fuels are the predominant mode by which we introduce carbon of very ancient origin back into the atmosphere. I will talk about, though, that that's not the only way that humans do it, and we have to think very clearly about how we do it. So not only do you need a value of carbon, and one that rises over time, but the value of carbon needs to be applied to all the carbon. And not just to the big emitters, and it's very popular to start off with a policy regime that goes after the big emitters. You go after electric utilities, and you leave the small emitters off the hook. You start with the big countries, and you leave the small countries off the hook. You start with fossil fuels, and you leave land use change emissions off the hook. Ultimately, that's a limited time also. You can't do that for very long into the future before you basically run out. Ultimately, you need to cover all the emissions that have to be in a control regime. And you have to value in the way that the atmosphere values, which is they're all the tons are valued equally. And so you actually have to communicate the value of these emissions, regardless of their sources, to everyone who's emitting. Limiting greenhouse gas concentrations to low levels, this is sort of a corollary to the first two, means rapid accession by virtually every major emitter in the world. You can't leave major emitters out for very long if you want to limit the concentration of CO2 to 450 parts per million. The challenge of scaling up is huge, and my colleagues who work here at Princeton, I don't have to explain that to them. They actually make this case very beautifully. That we're actually talking about taking things which are either done at very minuscule levels and turning them into some of the largest enterprises on the face of the earth, or that of that ilk. CO2 capture and storage, I'll talk more about that. Could be a major new technology in a climate-constrained world. Biotechnology is complex, but a potentially important component in addressing climate change. There have been a couple of recent papers that have come out in Science on this that are very interesting, and I'll show you some results that are along the same lines, but I think I have a different take on the issue than they do. Finally, end-use energy technologies both set the scale and the character of the global energy system. And finally, investing in energy technology development and basic science are ultimately going to be important components of stabilization. So that's the entire talk. The rest of it is just filling in the gaps. I'm an old guy. I'm a carbon person. If you're younger, you're a CO2 person. So I'm going to talk in terms of carbon. So multiply by approximately 4 if you're a CO2 person. If you're a CO2 person, take all the prices I have and divide them by roughly 4, and things will look a lot cheaper. Both of these appear in the literature, and as I say, I go back to carbon. Oops, what was that? So I'm going to start with the carbon cycle, which is sort of the place where I think everything was grounded. That's where I came into this field. And these are stabilization curves for the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, their anthropogenic emissions. The red line, the black line is history leading up to 2005. The red line is our mid-range forecast. It's the same as the U.S. Climate Change Science Program. Scenarios report 2.1a. It's the Mitigation version of it. It goes up to, by the end of the century, it's about 22 billion tons of carbon per year, and it's still rising. Stabilization at any concentration, as I argued before, is subject to the fact that you take hundreds of billions of year-old carbon and reintroduce it into the atmosphere ocean system. And the only thing nature can do is partition it. Roughly the partition today is 4 to 1. 4 will stay in will ultimately go into the ocean, and 2 will stay in the atmosphere. It rises over time as you saturate, but the implication of that is that every stabilization trajectory, even if you're interested in stabilization at high levels, has a peak of decline. As the stabilization concentration declines, the peak date becomes earlier, the peak is shallower. When you look at 550 parts per million, double pre-industrial concentrations, which are around 280 parts per million. The peak occurs a little bit past the mid-century mark, and then decline goes on indefinitely. These are global emissions. Originally, I did this work in 1996 with Tom Whitley and Rich Bridgels, and one thing has changed since that. It's basically the same calculation. And that is, when we did the original paper, there was a rise to the peak for 450. That is no longer there. Time has eclipsed that for 450 stabilization. The emissions begin to decline immediately. Actually, they began to decline 3 years ago, but that's just wrong. But we've gone past that. Secondly, I'll point out that in all these stabilization scenarios we're playing, the kind of game, it's kind of a game we play, and that is, it's not to exceed. The rule is you are never to exceed the given concentration. And so the way you actually run these scenarios is you ramp up to the concentration and what we do it in an economically efficient manner, and then you lock on. And so you actually have 2 regimes. And when I go to the next slide, you can see the concentrations. You can see what's going on there. You can see that, in fact, the price of carbon, and these are prices that the dual of the physical cycle, the carbon cycle, is the financial cycle. It's the value of a ton of carbon. And these are price trajectories that go out over a century, and you can see that for the 750 it rises. If it looks like it's rising at an exponential rate, it is rising at an exponential rate. If it looks like the 650 is rising at the same exponential rate, it is. And in fact, they're rising at the rate of interest in the model plus the rate of removal of carbon from the atmosphere, which for the purposes of 100-year calculation starts a little bit above 1% per year and then declines to a little bit below 1% per year by the end of the century. So in fact, the price of carbon is rising a little bit faster than the rate of interest. I think that's an important thing to bear in mind because it comes back and actually explains a lot of the things that you see coming out of some of the economic models. Similarly, if you look at the 550, remember the 550 had a peak. We actually are locking on by the year 2100. And so there's actually an exponential growth until you hit the concentration, and then you actually, it's whatever the price is that nature prescribes from the physical side, which is removal of carbon, that sets the amount of carbon that you're allowed to emit. It's whatever the oceans take up. And so, in fact, the rate of increase of the price of carbon hits a maximum when you hit the concentration, and after that, it actually slows down a bit. And it takes me now to some of the work that we're beginning to work on, which is scenarios that don't play this game the same. They go to a maximum, and then we continue to emit so that the concentration is just maintained. We actually are going to begin looking at what are called overshoot scenarios, in which you actually would come up here for the 450 scenario. That would be the maximum you'd ever get, and the price would continue to rise at the exponential rate until you actually got back to the emissions back to zero. Now, a couple of things that are worth pointing out. If you look at the 450 for the global price of carbon, that is the price that we put in the model, and we actually charge everyone in the world for all the emissions. And it's all the emissions of all the carbon. It doesn't matter whether it's fossil fuel emissions. It doesn't matter whether it's cement manufacturers. It doesn't matter if it's some guy out there in the Amazon basin with a machete. Everybody gets charged the same price for carbon. And for 450 parts per million, which is a fairly tight constraint, we actually, the price is only $100 a ton of carbon in the year 2020. It's actually less than that today. You actually start out with a lower price of carbon. For 550, it's only $20 a ton of carbon. For 650, it's only $10 a ton of carbon, and for 750, it's only $4 a ton of carbon. If your thing is, if you're a CO2 person, you divide those numbers by roughly 4, and you actually see very low prices of carbon. You actually see very low prices of carbon. That is if you, in fact, are able to do this in an economically efficient manner. And, in fact, you go through this process by which you repeatedly double the price until you get to the stabilization goal. That, I'll come back to what happens if we begin to relax that assumption. It's not pretty. But that actually drives, this is the 550 case, drives a radical change in the global energy system. The reference case on the right is the scenario from, as I said, the SAP 2.1a. It's the new report on emission scenarios that was put out by the Climate Change Science Program. And you can see that it's, even though non-emitting technologies, nuclear, wind, solar, grow to be very large enterprises on the order of all the oil and gas that's produced globally today. They are, in fact, continue to be dwarfed in these reference scenarios. And remember, reference scenarios, you actually say, what would the world be like if it turns out that climate change was simply a coding error, and you could go on and it really wasn't a problem. And that's this counterfactual. No one actually believes that that's the way the world will evolve, but that's the scenario that you use as a counterpoint to scenarios in which you say, all right, suppose that we do have to take action about climate change. The right-hand side is stabilization at 550. It's the global energy system. The red at the bottom is oil. You can see that oil continues to grow. This notion that we're about to run out of oil just doesn't hold up in the models. There is a limit to conventional oil, but oil is not scarce. Unconventional forms of oil, of liquids are tremendously abundant. And then, of course, there's a backstop, which you have in coal. You can turn that hydrocarbon into liquid hydrocarbon. There's a lot of gas. You can see gas in this world is a growing enterprise all the way out to through the end of the century. And coal continues as a growth industry throughout the end of the century, the reference case. When you move over to the stabilization case, it's really different. Certainly by the end of the century, oil is in decline, much more rapidly than in the reference scenario. Gas, if you look at the hash lines, that is, if it's blue, it's gas that is being used, but the carbon dioxide that is emitted from the oxidation process has been captured and stored in geological reservoirs. If you look at coal, the only coal left has ash lines by the end of the century. It's been captured and stored in geologic reservoirs. And the reason you can get away with all that is because you're only storing 250 billion tons by the end of the century, whereas today we store maybe 1 million tons a year in geologic repositories, is because we've reduced the energy by about, in addition to what is done in the reference case, by about the amount of the world's oil industry. We put in literally millions of wind turbines in this model. We have literally thousands, I think there are 4,000 1,000 megawatt reactors that get deployed in this case. And you can get away with so little because the biggest thing that's going on in the face of the planet is bioenergy. So it's a really radically different energy system. Let me come back to the delayed accession. What happens, the answer to the question is, what happens if everybody, it isn't one big happy world? What happens if the Annex 1 countries, that is the OECD countries, North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, plus Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, what if they go first? And what if the developing countries are delayed in coming in? And so one way to measure that is what happened to the price of carbon. And I plotted two figures here which answer that question. What we did is we said, all right, let's start off with that $20 a ton. I'll just normalize it and I'll say it's unit 1, so that's really $20 a ton. What happens if the first of the non-Annex 1 countries don't come in until 2020? That's about it. In Annex 1, the price has to rise because in the long run, it's a zero-sum game. You've got the atmosphere doesn't care where this stuff comes from. So you have to raise the price in the Annex 1 countries, and you raise it about 20% in the year 2020. Actually, this is in the U.S., but it's the same across all of the Annex 1 countries. If they don't come in until 2035, you raise it about 40%, and you're a little bit more than double it if they don't come in mid-century. So that's if you're stabilizing at 550. But there's a lot of interest in stabilizing CO2 concentrations. And by the way, these are CO2 concentrations as they might be measured at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. These are not CO2 equivalent. These are real CO2 concentrations. So for 550, it's not that big a deal. You can actually, you have some time if you're trying to stabilize the world at that. You can actually allow countries the luxury of coming in sort of due order. And the Annex 1s, instead of starting out in 2020, paying about $20 a ton, you pay about $40 a ton. But there's a lot of interest in stabilizing at 450 parts per million. And there the story is very different because the allowable emissions for 450 parts per million is only about 480 billion tons of carbon for the whole world going forward to the end of the century. So if the non-Annex 1, it's basically, it starts off, it's 5 times, it's $100 a ton instead of $20 a ton. So you start off with 5. It's a little bit more expensive if the non-Annex 1 countries begin coming in 2020, that is in 12 years. If they delay until 2035, it's 50 times more expensive. So 50 times $20 a ton. So it's $1,000 a ton in 2020 if you're not to exceed 450 parts per million. Delayed accession to 2035 by China means for the U.S. would have to have a price of $1,000 a ton if the world is to stay below 450 parts, not to exceed 450 parts per million. If you delay past 2035, it just can't even be done. So accession is really important. If you look at the 450 scenario and you look at how much emissions mitigation have to be, that if the non-Annex 1 countries come in 2020, then the U.S. has to be in 2020 40% below present in 12 years. You have to get 40% below present. If the non-Annex 1 countries don't come in until 2035, and they string on in the 2035 2035 to 2050 timeframe. They don't start coming in until 2035. Then, actually, by 2020, U.S. emissions have to be down two-thirds in 12 years. And beyond that, it's not even physically possible not to exceed 450. So hence the interest in overshoot scenarios, because I think 450 looks a lot more interesting if, in fact, you can go over and come back. I'm going to talk about one particular technology. I'm going to talk about several technologies. I'm going to talk about one in particular. For the moment, CO2 capture and storage. There are a couple of really good reports on this that came out in rapid succession. There's the one that the IPCC did, which is this one in red. There's the one that we did at the Joint Climate Change Research Institute and the Global Energy Technology Strategy Program, whose web address is on the right. And I think that they actually tell us a lot about CO2 capture and storage. First of all, the technology is fairly simple. What you do is you scrub CO2 like you would pollutant. You use an amine or you use an ammonia scrubbing system. You remove the CO2 from the flue gas, which in general entails cleaning it up before the fact. So in fact, you get rid of most of your other pollutants along the way. And then you put it in the pipe and then you inject it deep underground, a mile or so underground. And you put it into a rock. And the idea is, while the title of both reports is CO2 capture and storage, that has more to do with the European legal system than it has to do with any notion that we were going to go down and get it back. It's not really being stored, it is being disposed, and it is really, if you leave it there long enough, it should react with the rock and become rock itself. So we're not thinking about bringing it back. In terms of the global resource, we actually put together a geographically disaggregated estimate of global reservoir capacity in deep saline reservoirs onshore and offshore, in depleted gas reservoirs and depleted oil reservoirs, and in unminable coal seams. And even though most of the literature on CO2 capture and storage is about putting it in for tertiary recovery into oil and gas fields, there isn't really all that much available in oil and gas fields. The big reservoir capacity is in the deep saline reservoirs. If you look at the scenarios that have been constructed that estimate capture and storage of CO2, you see that even under the A1G scenario, stabilizing at 450 parts per million, you only get about 600 billion tons of carbon actually captured and stored over the course of the century. And that compares pretty favorably with the roughly 2,800 billion tons of carbon storage capacity that's available. So that's the good news. The storage capacity is distributed over the world in a fairly heterogeneous way. There are what I would describe as supergiants in the world. There's the North American, U.S., Canada, we have abundant reservoir capacity. There's the former Soviet Union and Australia and New Zealand. And in fact, in a lot of ways, certainly the North American reservoir capacity matches up fairly nicely with where the big point source emitters are. And so that's actually quite nice. If you're in the Ohio Valley and you're a big coal-fired power plant, the closest reservoir is very likely underneath your boiler. And that's the good news. But that's not everywhere in the United States, and it's not everywhere in the world. We did a simple ratio at which I just took cumulative emissions of all types, not captured and stored, but all emissions, all fossil fuel emissions for 14 regions of the world, and I ratioed them to the reservoir capacity. And what you find is that there are these four regions: Australia, New Zealand, former Soviet Union, Canada, and the United States, which are what I would describe as supergiants. You take all the emissions over the whole century, and you don't even come up to 10% of the reservoir capacity. You don't stress the reservoir capacity at all. For most of the world, The ratio is below 0.5. But the blue, which is Latin America, Africa, Mid East, South and East Asia, India, omit China here for the moment, Eastern Europe and Western Europe, all the ratios for all emissions are below 0.4. China was about 0.7, but we've got to actually gone back and done a new study, and there's probably twice as much reservoir capacity as we originally estimated. So even China looks to be in relatively good shape compared with emissions over the course of the century. Japan and Korea, on the other hand, are very limited time offers, and they have very little capacity. What it means then is that when you go back and you rerun the models and you actually require that people store carbon in the country or region in which it is captured, it actually changes the way the economies, the energy systems of those economies look. So that when you look at the Japanese economy, even though it does do some capture and storage, this is if you don't take the fact that there's no capacity into account and assume that they can just put it someplace. You get a lot of capture and storage in Japan, you get a lot of imported coal. If you take that out, you get a lot of nukes and you get a lot of wind, but you don't get a lot of coal. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why we should begin thinking about, will there be a trade in CO2? Could you in fact put together a deal where the Australians who have abundant capacity ship the coal north to Japan and take the CO2 and store it in Japan? How valuable is this? Well, ran an experiment. The 450 case is worth about $5 trillion present discount. In the 550 case, it's worth about $1.25 trillion. And in the 650 case, it's still worth about $500 billion. If you arbitrarily take out about half of the reservoir capacity, it barely changes the value of the technology. And the reason it barely changes the value of the technology is there's so much reservoir capacity. And even if you knock out 90% of it and say that only 10% of it is of economic interest, you still get most of the economic value for CO2 capture and storage. It's the difference between life and death for coal, both in any of the 450 and 550 scenarios. And the scale up into CO2 capture and storage is really staggering. It starts off at about 1 million tons a year present. We capture and store and monitor CO2 sites today about 1 million tons of carbon per year. And the model would actually have us capture and store about 70 million tons of carbon per year by the year 2020 in 12 years. That actually means that you have to get not only the technical capability in place, but also have to get the institutional capability in place so that people can make a business case for capturing and storing and adding $1 billion scrubber to a big power plant. But what is really interesting is when you look at the scale of the technology as it moves forward in time, that challenging jump in scale that I just showed you is now the small box on the left. And then when you look to see the scale of the capture and storage in 2050, it's another order of magnitude higher. It's about 600 million tons of carbon per year. And then by the end of the century, it's 6 billion tons of carbon per year. The scale up is really very demanding. I want to talk about land use and land cover and stabilization, because bioenergy it has a lot of potential, but it's a very complex system. There have been a couple of papers recently in Science that have argued that the program in the United States to turn corn into ethanol and use it as a biofuel, is actually releasing more carbon than it's saving, and B, raising the price of food crops around the world. And both of those have been argued. And in fact, I think it is a technology that has potential to be not not the corn technology. Corn technology is never going any place in terms of scale. But cellulosic, where you actually have the energy density that you need, has the potential to be a big player in stabilization scenarios. And yet it also has the potential to be a big problem at the same time. Bio is probably, there's a lot of different biotechnologies, so I don't want to throw them all in one basket. There's storage in soils, and there is purpose-grown crops. There is the crops that are actually dual purpose, where you actually have two products, where you have pulp and paper and energy. So there's a lot of different technologies. The one I'm going to be most interested here is the one where you're actually growing the crop for its energy content. And I've got two figures. This is the terrestrial carbon, net carbon flux from the minicam. And just a word about how we do this. Basically, the minicam, that model is an integrated assessment model. So it's got a global energy system in it. It goes all the way. It takes resources out of the ground, transforms them. It's driven by population and economic growth. But it also does the same thing with agriculture and land use. With agriculture and land use, it's driven by the incomes of the people that we hypothesize are living in the world at the time. And as they get richer, they actually get better diets. They first ramp up the amount of grain they consume, and then ultimately begin to shift over into proteins. And so there's demand for land. But that land is a fixed resource, and it's either going to be managed or unmanaged systems, but there's a fixed amount of land in which you could potentially grow things. And so we populate that land with vegetation, and then we associate carbon with the vegetation in that land. And then we set just like we run the global energy system model to determine supplies and demands, we run the agriculture and land use model to be consistent with those supplies and demands. And since one of those potential supplies and demands, the potential demands comes from the energy side, and the supplies comes from the agriculture side, you can actually have a squeeze going on. Fixed land, big new demand for land to grow biofuels, something's got to give. Either you're going to have to drive into lands that are currently being used for some other purpose, or you're going to drive into unmanaged ecosystems. And if you drive into lands that are currently being used for some other purpose, you're going to drive up the price. If you drive into the unmanaged ecosystems, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take the carbon, that carbon that was on the unmanaged ecosystem land. And what you're seeing here in this dotted, well, let me just start with the red line. That's our reference case in which we kind of work that out in a world in which there's no climate change and no stabilization motivation. And our model is a model where the terrestrial carbon cycle model has a CO2 fertilization effect. Plants like CO2, as you get more of it, they actually store more carbon. Whether that actually is just going on in the model, or whether the basic uptake of CO2 is really more about regrowth, I think we should come back and revisit that, but at least in this model, there's a CO2 fertilization effect, which is what explains why as you get higher and higher emissions and higher concentrations, you're actually getting more and more uptake by the terrestrial system in this model. Why when you stabilize at 750 parts per million, that you don't get quite as much uptake, because there isn't as much CO2 fertilization going on. Why at 650 parts per million, you don't get as much as in 750, and so forth down to 550. Now, at the 450 case, we started off and we ran our model, and what we found was that this model was not behaving properly. It was not solving. Because at 450, you don't have a lot of emissions that you are allowed by mid-century. You really have had to crank down, and something that's taking, what we discovered was that something was taking up all of our emissions. It was the land use model. The land use model was venting tremendous amounts of carbon. And what was going on in the model was that we put a price on carbon. We said that biofuels are carbon neutral. That is, they took up the carbon out of the air, so when they discharge it back into the air, it's a wash transaction. You're carbon neutral. And yet we were getting all these emissions. And of course, what was going on was the obvious after 2 weekends of plowing through the data, was the obvious. You were deforesting the place because in the 450 scenario, the price of carbon mid-century was up around $500 a ton of carbon, and biofuels look great from the energy side of the house. What the model wasn't taking into account was that over there in the agricultural land use side, where there was no value of carbon being applied, where the carbon was being just the way we do it, in our international negotiations. We said it doesn't count. It would be hard to do. It would be hard to measure that. So let's not. Let's pretend like it isn't being emitted. And what happened, of course, is you blow through all your emissions budget, and that was that's the dotted line here, and that actually doesn't even solve. You just have too much emissions. You actually have to go through 450 and come back down. The solid yellow line is when you place a value on carbon, which is the same everywhere. It's the same if you're doing cement. It's the same if you're doing fossil fuel combustion. It's the same if you're on land. And in fact, it works both ways. If you're putting carbon back into land, you get paid. At least our publication. The real world isn't our model. You get paid when you do that. And so it's really quite interesting. It actually makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference in the amount of land that is in unmanaged systems, and it makes a huge difference in being able to actually stable on 450 parts per million. And so I guess the bottom line is that all the carbon counts, and it all counts. When it gets to the atmosphere, it's all the same in the atmosphere. Another interesting pathway, another interesting technology, which we've just begun to look at, is actually combining that CO2 capture and storage. There's a lot of reservoir capacity. Once you add, essentially, you've got a piece of land, and if you start growing things on it, it's going to have a net primary productivity. And you're going to take up carbon, or at least you can. If you plant something that likes, that will store carbon on it. And if you remove it, and then remove the carbon from that biofuel, then of course you're net taking carbon out of the air. And basically, you're actually scrubbing the air, and it actually is an interesting technology. And in fact, again, this is one of the and we've been slow in publishing a paper on this, largely because it is such a huge. Let me just sort of skip. I'm going to skip ahead to it. We have such a huge. It has such a huge effect. Basically, we said, all right, we're going to do it in a large point source emitter. And where do you have large points? Where do you have large point sources? Well, you have an electric utility industry. And so the model built electric power plants, and it's going to feed these with biofuels. And in fact, one of the things that happens is that in just the plain old stabilization scenario where you don't have CO2 capture and storage with the biofuels, the biofuels go to liquids. Because the transportation sector is really a tough nut to crack. So little of the cost of moving people and things is in the fuel. It's all in the capital and operating costs. And so it's the cheap way to get the carbon out of transportation. But if you have CO2 capture and storage with the biofuels, it actually all goes over into power generation. And when it gets over to power generation, what happened was that, well, this is really a great way to control emissions. I'm actually producing electricity, and I'm serving my energy needs, and at the same time, I'm taking carbon out of the air. What a great deal. And in fact, it was such a great deal that the model said, well, let's everybody do this. And then it got to all the power plants and converted them, and it said, still not producing enough electricity to justify this. How do I get people to buy more electricity? Well, I'll pay them. I'm so trying to pay them. and then crashed. And so we actually had to make a few adjustments to that, because I don't think that's going to be a workable business model. But I think it actually tells you a little bit about the potential of that technology, that technology combination has a great deal of power. And these are results where we arbitrarily just said, listen, you can only have so much electricity and then you're done. And what it did was it dropped the cost for, let's see, I think this is a 450 scenario to fraction of GDP. So, but it took you from the red line and basically dropped you by about 2/3 to 3/4 of the price of carbon emitting. It meant that the transportation sector, basically you were scrubbing it with the plants that were being deployed. And so this is a technology, again, that has potential large-scale deployment and very large implications for agriculture, land use, and the way humans produce and consume energy. And I don't know whether I want to do overshoot scenarios or not, but basically the idea is that, in fact, you have a allowable emission that we typically take to be, we derive it from the not to exceed. For example, 450 not to exceed allowable emission is 480 billion tons of carbon. That's integrated 2005 to 2100. Cumulative emissions over 1,000 years, though, are approximately, and it is an approximate number, approximately 1,650 billion tons of carbon. That is, over 1,000 years, that's what cumulative emissions could be. And for 350 parts per million, cumulative emissions over 1,000 years is 350 parts per million. Or for 350 parts per million is 808 tons. You can begin thinking, if you begin thinking about overshoot scenarios, that is, you can actually begin thinking that you actually got some latitude. But it does raise issues. It raises issues about how far do you overshoot. How long are you at higher concentrations than your long-term steady state? But quite frankly, if you look at the IPCC, what's the, this is not a test question, but if you look at what the big debate was when we were trying to frame up the fifth assessment report, and we were trying to craft the set of scenarios, and when we handed them off to the climate modelers, that they would span the space, that is, they go from low scenarios to high scenarios, they gave a nice, robust suite of trajectories, and they had a certain distance between them in terms of their radiative forcing. And you looked at the low scenarios. To get to the low scenarios, those low scenarios are not to exceed. You just can't get to low radiative forcing. And the big debate on the North engine is all about the low scenario. How low could you actually go? And there was a 2.9 watt per meter squared scenario that the Dutch had run. And basically it was made possible by that CO2 capture and storage plus biotechnology combination. But it hit a peak, and then it had begun to come down. You actually had to come down to 2.9. And they had run a 2.6, actually they had to run it. They'd done a sidebar calculation, which later made them nervous because they'd forgotten to account for the nitrogen fertilizers, which should have made them nervous. And so the big debate was, should we use the 2.6 or the 2.9? They're all overshoot scenarios. And so I think there's going to be a lot of interesting research that's going to come forward looking at these overshoot scenarios in which we say, if you want really low scenarios, if you want to come back to historically observed concentrations, rather than going up to some max and then sitting on it indefinitely, then you're actually going to have to start thinking about what are the implications of these overshoots. Just say a couple things about end-use technology, which are a little bit different than you normally think. End-use technologies really set the scale of the global energy system. If you look at the emissions patterns for CO2, the one on the left is the reference case. It's predominant electric power generation, plus transportation, and this dark burgundy color is the unconventional emissions from refining unconventional fuels. From refining unconventional fuels. That's the oil shales, that's the coal to liquids, it's the tar sands, those are the emissions. It's a big emission source in the reference scenario. So a little hydrogen in there, but it doesn't penetrate very far. And in fact, end-use technologies in the reference scenario are in fact lowering the emissions in buildings and industry. What you find in the stabilization scenario when we put a price on carbon is that the character of the scenario changes. Power generation stops growing about here. Actually, it stops growing. It stops growing right about there, which is stable. It's basically stable, and then comes down, and then begins to decline and gets smaller and smaller. Power generators are very rapid responders in terms of getting the emissions out, because at the investment margin, they just start investing in all the non-emitting technologies. As a consequence of that, you can find that another thing is going on, which is that also responding to those carbon taxes are the buildings and industry people who virtually get out of the emissions business altogether. By the time you get to the end of the century, there is nobody in our model on a 550 path that puts a natural gas furnace into a building of any kind. You just don't do it. You put a heat pump in. The buildings in these models that have to heat still are all using heat pumps. The transportation sector is the most difficult to get the emissions out. You get it all, you almost back out all of the emissions from the unconventional liquids and gases. In fact, one of the figures in the back I'll show you is it's almost a one-for-one swap out between growth in bio, which takes over that growth margin for the transportation fuels, and removal of the coal to liquids technology. So there's a lot of talk about building coal to liquids plants right now, and in a climate-constrained world, they don't survive. You can see that there are a few of them that start up, they don't make it. They become stranded assets. The other thing that is going on is that much of the emissions mitigation in the building sector is coming by fuel substitution. They're going to electricity. They electrify. And in the transportation sector, they get biofuels, but it's not nearly as prominent as the effect in buildings and in industry where electrification, where there are lots of options to electrify, and the power sector is getting out of the emissions business very rapidly. And in fact, one of the things that the electric utilities don't realize is that in a climate-constrained world, and I give this talk to utility execs from time to time, and what they don't realize is that in a climate-constrained world, if all the carbon is valued equally, that their price relative to their competitors is falling. What they see is they're going to get a carbon tax, and they see, oh, my absolute price of electricity is going to go up. But in fact, relative to their competitors, their price is falling. And so they get a bigger and bigger share, and then you get this electrification effect that helps the building sectors get out of their emissions. Now, one of the scenarios that I ran was, what happens if you just take the biggest single emitter, that big yellow thing, you just go after it, and you leave land use off the hook, and you leave the end use sectors off the hook, and they don't see the value of carbon. Well, what happens is that the costs go up by a factor of 5. Because what happens is you send all the wrong signals. What you do is you tell the people who are buildings, build that natural gas furnace. Electricity is getting expensive relative to fossil fuels. Heavy up. And so what happens in the models is that you send all these wrong signals, and the cost of getting a ton of carbon out of the system gets very high. It's another example of all the carbon counts. One note before I get to the end, and I think I'll just finish up in these couple of slides. There's a paper that Steve and I were just discussing it, and it's done by Bjelke, Wigley, and Green, and they talked about scenarios, and they talked about the emissions that are embedded in scenarios. And I put here 3 lines. This actually goes back, this is a very old figure of mine, it's just been updated, but it's the reference scenario that I've been talking about, which goes up to about 22 billion tons of carbon per year, has built in a lot of technological change. Every scenario that has ever been crafted and used by the IPCC has abundant technological change in it, and I've got lots of examples that I could try on how spectacular the assumed changes are, but they vary from scenario to scenario. But there's a lot of it. And if you just run the scenario and you just take out all the energy technology improvements, and you just run the scenario, you get this purple line. Of course, the stabilization at 550 is the blue line, but you get this purple line, which is the reference case emissions without the technological improvement. And what I've argued isn't that there's something wrong with the scenarios, because we actually put the red line out. That's our best guess as to where the world would go in this fictitious environment in which nobody cared about climate, this counterfactual environment. But the purple line, I think the lesson that I always draw from it is that we assume a lot of technological change. But if you look at what we've been doing with the R&D budgets in the United States, in Western Europe, in the world, if you look at the energy R&D budgets, what they've been, they actually they fell like a rock for a while. They've been stable at a low level, but if you think that there's a guarantee that you get the energy technologies that we assumed simply because we assumed them, that's not necessarily going to be the case. That actually someone has to do something to develop the technologies that will actually deliver the reference case, to say nothing of getting to stabilization. One other point is that this is a very long-term problem. To stabilize, you start off with a very big challenge, as I said. The technologies in the deployments in the first step are very, very large, like capture and storage. But the same is true for all the technologies that expand in the stabilization cases. And you start with what you got. And then you work on improving the technologies that you have to make them better, to make them less other resource consuming. But the one thing that doesn't get realized is that we're in this for the long haul, that it isn't about stabilizing emissions, it's about driving emissions to zero. The bulk of emissions mitigation, even in the 450 scenario, 75% of all emissions mitigation occurs after the year 2050. And that you actually need to invest in the foundation, the scientific foundations, and there is a new motivation to expand basic science budgets, because you can't predict what the technologies are going to be, but you know that the technologies that don't have names that contribute to emissions mitigation are going to be built on the foundations of the science that gets done today. And if you don't think that after 2050 matters, if you go to this U.S. Climate Change Science Program report on scenarios, there are 3 modeling groups in there. So I've shown you results from our group, but there's also a group up at MIT that did this work, and a group at Emory. And up to 2050, all 3 modeling groups, if you plot out how they respond to the price of carbon, the amount of emissions mitigation you get, they all look the same. You all get roughly the same response. And you'd think that, in fact, you get the same costs. But the MIT model costs 10 times more than either of the other 2 models. 10 times more. Yet, up to 2050, they're identical. There's nothing to choose between those 3 models. They're identical for all practical purposes. So what's different? Well, what's different is that in the post-2050 period, the MIT model has trouble getting carbon down to really low levels. They don't have the technologies. And so the technologies that we have in our model, as I said, we We don't have, nobody in our building sector puts in a natural gas furnace in the basement. The utilities have options in wind and solar and production and storage. They got biofuels. They've got lots of options that they deploy. And so our costs come down to very low levels. And yet, if you don't have those options in the post-2050 period, it casts a shadow back to the present. And it casts a shadow back, and this sort of comes back to the fact that it's a stock pollutant and not a flow pollutant. It's a stock. It's cumulative emissions in the atmosphere that matter, and therefore the value, the shadow price of that carbon rises at the interest rate plus the rate of removal of the carbon from the atmosphere, which is basically the ocean uptake, a little bit less than 1%. But it rises a little bit faster than the rate at which you're discounting. And so it casts a pretty darn big shadow, and if you are going to stabilize at prescribed level, and you actually have to account for the fact that you're going to have a lot of trouble in the post-2050 period, that pricing gets conveyed all the way back to today. And so it really does matter what you're doing about the future, and if you say, well, I'll be optimistic or I'll be pessimistic, but the future actually does unfold over time, and you have to make the appropriate adjustments. Like I said, you wanted to know what I would do in terms of some policy. So here's my policy advice. 5 things. Stabilization requires that the greenhouse gas have a price. The price of greenhouse gas should be the same for the gas, irrespective of the emission source. The price of the greenhouse gas should rise, not fall over time. And it really helps if you make decision makers aware that you're going to raise that price, and it's going to be faster than they're discounting it away. And finally, that you actually want to increase the R&D, and we can get into the argumentation for it, but it's a global public good. You actually have to have value to get to the socially optimal level. And let me just sort of leave it at that. There's a lot more in this report that we put out last May, and here's the website for it, and you can get copies. I'll be happy to send you hard copies. But I think this is a good place to stop, and if you have questions or discussion points, it's a good place to open that up. Well, let's just start.
What are the prospects of you see for increased energy in the U.S.?
That's a really good question. That's a predictive question, and I'm not particularly well suited to make a prediction. I would hope that I hope that we're going to turn things around. They've been stable for a while. There's real interest in increasing R&D. There's a lot of pressure right now on budgets. And we're fighting a war in Iraq, and that claims a lot of resources and it eats into a lot of things. My prediction would be, as that war winds down, there will be resources available for other important problems for us to address. And that would be my prediction, is that if the war in Iraq comes down, we'll start seeing budgets for other things begin to ramp up. Okay.
Just to get a calibration on what a ton of carbon costs me, if I were to order a ton of coal to be delivered to my door, what would that cost today?
I have a little spreadsheet on here. I can dig it out for you and get it. Basically, well, rather than give you a wrong number and have everybody write it down, let me just dig that out for you and give you the right number and get you the multiplier for you. You want to take names down, or you know, or you want to?
Names of people.
Well, yeah, so we get a cube, or I'll just work my way up to the top and
Just do the best you can.
yeah.
So what I'm wrestling with is the virgin story on oil, and you bring up the fact that there are a lot of reserves of unconventional oils, and at the same time there's serious supply constraints in the global market, both geologically but also with the above ground sort of nationalism and other factors. And so as the oil price continues to hit records, 118 today per barrel, what do you see the oil price changing to so that it is such a big factor? Because I see lots of people talking about 200 plus per barrel, and if that were so, I would see an opening for solar and wind to come in a much bigger way, and other renewables that you mentioned.
Right. In fact, I think you raised a really good point. The model does not generate a $118 a barrel price of oil. And when oil prices began to shoot up, we began looking at how come we're not getting this result? We've got oil resources in there. We've got demands. It's not a hard thing to just move the Chinese demand up a little bit. Although we're not far off on total demand from the Chinese economy. We're actually very close to the estimate, and so we didn't even have to move that up very much. So so we go back. Why is that? Part of it is that it's a long-term strategic model. It's actually sort of working out the long-term supplies and demands. It's not actually trying to do the spot market. That's the first thing. But then if you begin to unpack, so what's going on in the spot market that's not going on in a long-term strategic market, and actually what's not going on out there in the real world that you would expect to see going on in the real world. First thing is that we realized is that the oil price of a barrel of oil is denominated in dollars. That was a revelation. And that the dollar is doing just horribly. If you rebase it to the portfolio of currencies that are actually buying the oil, then you take out something like 40% of the change in the price, and if you report it as an index in the model rather than as the dollar price. And so that's one of the things that's going on. And the other thing that's going on is that there actually is a spot market, and there is risk aversion that's going on, and people are actually buying forward into the oil market and holding it up. But if you believe that $100 a barrel oil is a permanent fixture, if you believe that that's going to go on for 20 years, then there's almost nothing you can't make money at. You get a bicycle and open up a little generator. Oil shale and oil sands all make sense, but that's not good for the climate. But so do wind and solar, and just about anything makes sense at $100 a barrel oil. If you look to see the investment behavior out there, there's not a lot of people who you don't see the money flooding in, although you do see expansion of the oil sands, and you do see expansion of wind, although that's a little bit indirect because that's coming through power generation, and that's competing with the oil, and it's a little bit less direct. But the oil price, I don't think that you're going to. I don't believe the model. It's hard to support that price. And it looks to me like somebody's going to get left holding the bag on that oil price. But
I feel a need to comment on your estimates of global storage capacity that you presented. If you compare that to what is in the IPCC report on CCS, you're actually at the very high end of the scale. And even that, according to some people, is rather optimistic, even the lower estimates of the IPCC report. And if you look now in Europe, what's happening there in some areas, that it turns out that many of the fields that people want to store CO2 in are really kind of small. Which means that after 4 years, we can close down a field and move to another field and make all the costs of injection and transport infrastructure again. So it seems to me that you're a bit optimistic in terms of theoretical storage capacity. At the same time, you're putting a lot of emphasis on it as one of the major options. So I wonder whether that's can be.
You raise a good point. And in fact, when we went through and did our estimates of it, and that was the first time that it had been done globally with regional disaggregation. There have been a number of estimates before that, there were global numbers that were out there in the literature, but these were the first ones where we actually went through with a team, had geologists, we went through all the basins in the world and produced those estimates. But what I didn't describe to you was that each one of those 5 categories, in fact, is a graded resource. That there are the resource grades with 4-way entrapment, for example. There are resources that are large 4-way entrapped resources. And then, actually, in each one of those categories, there are 5 different grades to the resource. But the bottom line was, we just systematically took it out. We took, for example, 90% of it and said, listen, suppose that you only get 10% of it. It's still a very valuable option to have. So I would say that I think that result is fairly robust. Whether you get that whole 2,800 billion tons capacity, or whether in fact you get more, we've got, in North America you have a pretty good idea. There's a lot of good geology that's available for North America. And so those estimates we feel are fairly comfortable with, although even there's a lot of detail and it isn't one homogeneous resource by any stretch of the imagination. But I think the result is there's a lot of capacity, and it actually matches up fairly well with the large point source emissions. I think that will hold up. But not only is there the resource question, but then there is can you actually get through the institutional issues? Can you work through? Do you get credit for it? Do you want to give people credit for it? Do you have a monitoring and verification technology? Do you have liability covered? And those are big, major issues that actually, before that technology ever gets into common practice, would have to get sorted through. So, yeah, we had a question up there.
Yep. So, how confident are you for your scenario prediction after 2050?
Actually, we've done, we do, besides the point estimates. I don't believe any of those scenarios. First of all, I don't believe that there's any chance that the world is going to get out to 2050 and the price of carbon is going to be zero everywhere. That's just not going to happen. I think it's just not going to happen. So I don't believe the reference scenario for that purpose. Although I don't believe that the other scenario, which was this perfect implementation of emissions mitigation. So, I don't believe those scenarios. But how far off could they be? By 2050, you can get pretty far off. I can pull up the probability density functions for our uncertainty analysis, but my recollection is that you could be off. Well, you could be pretty far off. And I can get you the numbers, but things unfold very rapidly. By mid-century, the world could evolve in a lot of different ways, and so the uncertainty grows. And that's why when we do these scenarios, going forward for the IPCC, you actually take this wide range that goes from about 3 watts per meter squared all the way up to 8.5 watts per meter squared reinforcing. So you get this huge range that is intended to cover pretty much the spectrum of what you might imagine could evolve over the century of time scale. Yeah.
I listened to NPR yesterday for about an hour and a half, and they talked about cap and trade versus straight carbon tax. It was very interesting, and I found myself actually siding with the guy from the American Enterprise Union, which I don't normally. The thing is, one of least one of the big take-home points I get is that all carbon's carbon. And you've got to find a way to make it all pay. Or you're going to have this stuff come back and some of your costs are just going to skyrocket on you if you let certain carbon get away with it. Is there, and you had implicit and explicit, is there any, ignoring all political stuff, it just economically doesn't matter if you can cap and trade versus some kind of an explicit carbon?
The easiest way to do it is to tax it.
That's correct.
The easiest way to do it is to just put a tax on it. It's clean, it's obvious, it communicates a cost to people. Politically, that's a very difficult thing to do.
I suspect the American Enterprise Institute is pushing that for just that reason.
But it is, but I would argue that in fact you do want people to value carbon. You don't want them to say it's not worth anything, I don't care what happens when I, you name it, invent carbon. So you really want people to get that message. You can do it with cap and trade, you can do it with, cap and trade will generate a price on everything that's capped, and it's the same, you're monitoring and measuring. But the problem with the cap and trade is getting the intertemporal price escalation right. And there are guys who are very clever about this, and I've heard regimes where by oversubscribing and then holding auctions at exactly the right time, you can get the right price path over time. It gets very complicated very fast. Now the implicit is that you could also regulate it. You could actually say, I'm going to regulate this. I'm going to say, new sources have to have this character, and there are ways to regulate it. But one way or the other, you need to end up valuing all the carbon. And the problems with the other regimes, particularly the regulatory regimes, and that's the hot thing right now in international negotiations, is to say, let's have sectoral goals. And the sectoral goals is we'll have each sector do its best. And they haven't quite worked out exactly how that's going to be determined. But of course, when you set it up that way, every time you set up these regimes in which there's an implicit value one place and a very different value other places, like zero, you set up these really bad incentive systems to go and do these things where this value is zero, but still have emissions, and you start, it's like, it's good news, folks, the end-use sectors are off the hook. They get to emit, let's just, let's heavy up. Let's see, is there some over here I ignore?
I think we're going to have to stop.
That's right.
I want to go back to the work by Wigley on the built-in technological change in the reference scenario that's used for the IPCC work on the scenarios they did in 1992.
That's me. Wiggly did that.
Well, in any event, it seems that recent trends show that we're closer to a fixed technology rather than to a natural technological change approach. And what do you think? I was wondering what do you think should be done in the future work of the IPCC on scenarios? Should we in fact take that as more of a precautionary approach, or should we continue to build in technological change?
Yeah, I wouldn't make too much out of any particular year. These are long-term scenarios you've got, and there's no intent whatsoever to try to reproduce the business cycles. And so you get growth spurts, and then you get recessions, and so you're not trying to track all that stuff. I think that the reason that you actually have this particular phenomenon that you have at present, which is that underestimate, has more to do with the fact that China has gone through a growth spurt, and that it's growing extremely rapidly. And underneath the shadows of China is India and the rest of South and East Asia, which is growing more rapidly than many of the models had estimated earlier. And so that's more the motivation. Now, can China sustain that over 100 years? No, there's no way you can do that. Sustain double-digit growth over 100 years. But looking at a range of scenarios that encompasses this broad spectrum is, I think, a good strategy. And going forward, there's, my hope is that the IPCC is actually entering onto a new phase, and we won't go into that here, but that's a whole different talk. But I think the opportunity in that phase is to actually explore that range more robustly than has been done in the past.
One comment, which is that coal delivered to a power plant, I think $30 a ton of coal, might be $20 for, that might be $40 a ton of carbon, reports carbon, and so that's the kind of reference you have. If you're going to look up the price of carbon, some report, price of coal, some reports carbon, obviously varies a lot, depends on how much transport and so on. That was the answer to one of the questions. I'm going to ask one last question. Favorite problem. Every one of these models assumes that the correct price of CO2 will rise over time. But why should it? There's systems stuck in our ways. Good, swift, kicking the past. High carbon price in 2010s and 2020s might really kick us into a new domain. By 2040, we will be able to lower the price of carbon because we figured out these alternatives. Why doesn't this ever get considered by
well, my people believe that it's a stock pollutant. That, in fact, you're trying to...
But it actually isn't the stock pollutant.
The climate depends on the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, not on the emissions. And so that makes it a stock. It's a stock. It's the stock of carbon in the atmosphere, not the flow. So it really is a stock problem.
It's a stock problem, but it's not an exhaustible stock. Everybody think about it.
Thank you.